to how to identify your key product metrics to unlock value. We're going to be we're talking here by David Jesse, who has held very cool product positions at really cool companies. So, and he's going to talk a little bit about product metrics, which we should all do more of, as everybody knows. So I will, with that, I will pass it off to him.
Thank you. Sorry, we're a couple minutes late because of my Microsoft Teams decided not to work today. That wasn't meant to be shade about Microsoft Teams. It was a description, not a good. Okay, great. So hopefully you're in the right place for this one. If not, no offense taken if you move around. So generally, we're going to talk about just some background on why this is an important topic, in my opinion. How you can think about coming up with a more structured way for your product metrics. I give a Chicago example, which I lived, which was Groupon in 2010, and then talk about how to put it to use. I have time at the end for questions. I think normal format here is if you have questions along the way, that's okay too. Okay, so background. I've been in product for north of 20 years. I've been the first head of product at a startup 3 times. Wide range of companies from Series A through public companies. I try to be at growing companies, although sometimes that's more successful than others. And then I've had focus and I've lived US international in these things. The last 10 years, I've been doing a lot of coaching and advising, and that's what I currently am doing now. Some of that has been on the side. The last 2 years, it's been full time. And you can just see some of the companies here. There's a number of Chicago companies in there. And part of that is coaching people, fractional head of product. I helped develop a product leadership course last year. So right now, that's my focus, is helping other people improve their product practices, whether it's transforming how they operate, coaching the leaders, et cetera. And this is the group that I work with. We're called Prodify. It's a number of people similar to me who have years of experience as product executives. The others have very similar profile to me and have turned to applying that to help make other companies successful. The founder of Prodify, co-founders wrote a book a couple years ago called Build What Matters. I mentioned the training course, and we do workshops like this, as well as work directly with people and teams. Okay, so the goals here, trying to help you clarify what does it mean to quantify your product KPIs. And this is a couple of things, clarifying the value you're delivering to your customer, whether that's internal or external. Thinking about a more structured way of understanding the system that you're actually creating and optimizing and improving. And then if you do this really well, it helps you highlight your own impact, your team's contribution, your contribution, et cetera. And then we'll talk about how you can use that to manage your product in terms of informing what you work on. How do you measure progress? And how do you have a stronger feedback loop so that once you launch something, you can learn from it and you can hopefully get better over time and tell the difference between which things are working and which things are not working. So I think about it as a couple angles here. These are like different variations of why you might care about this. I mean, having metrics, of course, everyone talks about, that's important, but here's some things that I think are pretty tangible. Okay, so there's this micro example of you launch a feature and you're trying to figure out what metrics do you track and what decisions do you make. By the way, this is a modified, anonymized version of a real example from a client. And I asked them how they measure, and this is what they gave me. So these were the metrics for further user ramp. If you look at these are mostly around making sure things aren't broken. Like, okay, that's not a bad start. This was only the tip of the iceberg, though. So then they had the level 1 metrics for A/B tests. They had level 2 metrics for A/B tests. And then they had guardrails. And I think this is something like 16 metrics in here. And And so then my question is, how do you know if it's working or not? Like these all could have different signs in different directions. And if one of these is bad, are you blocked? Basically, if you think about this, like if you're the manager and saying, when can we ramp this to 100%? The answer with that list of metrics might be never. And then you're stuck. And then you put all this investment in the future and you're not sure if it was successful or not, and you're paralyzed. And that's the variation. Another variation is the product manager looks along this list and they pick the 1 or 2 or 3 metrics that look good. And they use that to justify doing what they wanted to do anyway, which was roll this thing out. And so it's not really a data-driven decision, even though they're using metrics. So the macro version of this is, let's say you're asked to do a team update and a quarterly review, or what'll come up in the next month or two is do your self-assessment for your annual review. What is that going to look like, and what can you put in there? There is a version where you can say, we launched these X number of features, we hit our dates, our velocity was good. That is part of being a good product team. Like if you don't launch anything, you will never make progress, but that's really a feature delivery team. And I know a lot of us get pressure to hit dates and do that, and we're kind of this by default, but this is part of value, and this is not really correlated with maximizing value. There's something that's a little bit better, which is they have a list of launches and they've got metrics for each. But those metrics might be what I showed you a minute ago. They're kind of random. There's a bunch of different stuff. Some are positive, some are negative. And on the plus side, you're taking it a step beyond being a feature launch team, delivery team. The minus side is it's all over the place. It's not tactical. And you're probably saying, hey, we move these 10 things forward an inch, instead of really being able to talk about the impact that your team had. So of course, what I think is ideal is you can say, here's my team's charter. Here's our focus areas. We're trying to really improve this one thing, and here are the couple inputs and drivers to that. And if you can show that, and if you can over time show those metrics go up into the right, or I guess sometimes down to the right, but they improve, that's a more strategic needle moving approach, and you can have highlighting a bigger impact, taking it away from we launched 30 things and half of them didn't work, or really probably more likely 3/4 didn't work, and stuff like that. But you can say, here's our key outcome, and this went from X to Y, and here's how that's valuable for the business. That's really what we're trying to get at here. So there's a couple of quotes I look at from this. One is from Steve Jobs, which is, as we've tried to come up with a strategy and a vision for Apple, it started with what incredible benefits can we give to the customer? Now, you might only own a small part of your overall product, but you can still think about that exercise of like, what is your product? Who is it serving? What benefits can you give? The other thing is this strive for being more quantified about this. So Lord Kelvin from science, when you can measure what you're speaking about and express it in numbers, you know something about it. When you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of a meager and unsatisfactory kind. That's really what this is trying to get to, is you understand it better, it's clearer, it's more structured, and it's customer driven. Here's what happens instead a lot of times. I mean, there's variations of things that happen instead. There's the other one where you have too many metrics. There's this one, we're data driven, be honest. I am being honest. What metrics are you tracking? Revenue. The problem with that, obviously a business is built on revenue. It doesn't survive without revenue. But, these are things that are outputs, they're sales focus. They tend to be very short-term focus. And the problem is, that is not, the customer doesn't use your product because they want to give you revenue. Maybe if you're a charity, but generally they're looking for some value. And if you over focus on revenue, that means you keep chasing the thing that someone in sales says, if you build this, this customer will sign for X dollars. So you get back into the feature factory. Your product gets really bloated. A lot of the features have an audience of one. That one customer may or may not use it.
Yes.
And then no one else does. And you're basically taking orders from sales. trying to get to is something where you're thinking about your key customer outcomes inform the roadmap. So you think about what is the key outcome you want to drive from both customer and business perspective. Here you can imagine like what's the ideal state for this a couple of years from now. This is the 10x idea of like step change improvement to that. That becomes your vision. Your strategy is how you get from here to there. Your roadmap becomes starting to work on the first part of that. And then obviously, if you don't execute, you don't have anything. There's a saying, vision without execution is hallucination. You need to have both, but if you don't have a vision, then you're going to be just building random things. Having clear metrics helps, especially with identifying the key outcomes. It does flow all the way through, but it then helps with your roadmap as well. So you want to know, how does your customer define your product's value? What are the drivers? What do you focus on improving? And then how do you use this to organize your team and make them more effective? Step one is, first of all, you have to say, who is your customer? Who's your target persona? And this is not a marketing persona where you have, there's the alliteration name. You've got, John, the job writer or whatever, and, he's 26 to 34 years old or whatever. This is usually broader. It's like, is it a buyer? Is it a seller? Is it a user of some kind? Who is it? Why they're coming to your product, and why would they pay for it? So if you think about them, if you were to ask them, and by the way, you should do this if you haven't already, you can talk to customers. Why do they want your product? What are they looking for? Why is it valuable to them? If they could quantify, or if they could measure, like, what's the difference between a good product and a bad product and a great product, what would they say? And so this is the top of what we're going to make into a pyramid. Some people talk about this as a job to be done, or North Star KPI. This is really the thing you're working towards. Your product should all be in service of making this thing better. But then you want to get to, like, how do you actually do that? Oh yes, go ahead.
Are you going to share the slides?
Do we share this? I'm happy to. Yeah, I think they'll be.
Stop taking pictures.
Yeah, you don't have to take a picture.
Yeah, we'll post them on the site after.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So then you want to figure out, like, what are the things that actually help you deliver that? Because sometimes that key outcome is very general. So you want to think about the pillars, the parts of your value proposition. These are problems that you can start to solve. And if you have a team with multiple sub-teams, these are things that they can specialize in as well. So for example, if you look at consumer, take Amazon, a lot of times it's things like selection, price or value, or speed and convenience. In B2B, they might be looking for insights, efficiency, compliance, things like that. And as I mentioned, a team that's part of a bigger organization will probably have to be more specific about this because they're working on one part of it. But these are things that you can improve and scale. Ideally, they're things you can explain very quickly. You shouldn't be able to, have to pull up your spreadsheet to figure this out. Like these examples above, Amazon has 3 pillars that they talk about, and they've talked about for a long time, at least in their separate from AWS, but their original business. So think about, if you improve these things, will this set you up to win? And you should be able to create dashboards about from these. So they can be qualitative description, but they have a quantitative measurement as well. Step 3 is the product KPIs. And this is where it really becomes even more actionable. You keep asking, what are the things that drive those? How do you deliver that? And so it's almost like a root cause, or it's like going deeper to say, why, how do we do this? What are the inputs, et cetera? So a lot of times, in customer behavior, there's necessary, like if they don't try it, obviously they don't get the benefit. They have to be able to complete that. So there's a funnel involved. You want them to come back. You want it to be something that they return. And so you could think about those things. You could also look at, what is the benefit they get? Is there lift to something? Is there value? Is there coverage? And these are things that often can be tied to a very specific feature. How these relate together is the stuff at the bottom should be what drives the stuff at the top. And it helps you focus on a small number of metrics because they should be things in this relationship. You can figure out what's important because things that are not on this pyramid are probably not as important. And then there's also a dynamic here, which is the stuff at the bottom is more directly actionable. You can think about features to improve that stuff at the bottom. And you can get a measurement very fast. The stuff at the top might be very slow to move. Think about retention. You might not know if retention went up for months, but you can know if people are using your feature more. And so that's the leading indicators at the bottom and the lagging indicators at the top. So try to design this around the leading indicators that will eventually lead to the improvement in the lagging indicators. So here's how it looked like in Groupon in 2010. I don't know, how many of you were around in Chicago in 2010? And used Groupon? Anyone? Okay. Probably if I asked how many use Groupon today, it'd be a lot fewer, unfortunately. But we had some successes. So in the early days, each Groupon market featured one deal per day. The model was built around its limitations. We had a tiny community of customers and merchants. So if you think about it, there would be one deal for Chicago. And if you live in the suburbs of Chicago or downtown, if you were interested in activities versus restaurants, you just got the same email and you either liked it or you didn't like it, and you bought it, you didn't buy it. The Groupon team got big, but at that time we were really small. We had no dedicated PM or user experience to start the year. I joined in February. There was a single engineering team that had a lot of contractors. So it's not like Groupon was this big company at this time. We had to be very selective about what we did. Now, if you could think about what might have been our consumer pyramid at this time, by the way, you could also do this for merchants. There's, Groupon had multiple sides. Ultimately, we wanted people to have great experiences, which really you could think about as the number of Groupons that were redeemed. Pillars of that were savings. That was the incentive for people to buy this. Selection. So if we offered a number of deals in each market, and then was it relevant for you? So if you didn't like the deal, it wasn't relevant. If you liked it, it was relevant. And initially, Groupon was very simple. There was an email that had a featured deal. And then we realized that we could do more if we had a side deal. It was hard coded, so everyone got the same featured deal and side deal. And then they realized that in small markets, especially, there wasn't a deal every day. So they had some evergreen backfill deals. They called them national deals. Like you could get an online photo album at a discount, things like that. So this was low tech efforts, but enabled by tech to improve our selection. We started to realize that was still very limited. And so we released deal targeting. This is one of the first things that I worked on. This enabled us to have different deals for different customers featured based on what we knew about them. And that helped us really scale the number of deals. It helped us serve customers better. It helped merchants not be overwhelmed because we were sending their deal to 1 million customers in one day, et cetera. And so I can talk about some of the execution of how we did this, and I'll get back to the pyramid. I was a new PM on this. We ran a manual test in Seattle. We arranged for 2 merchants that had pizza. So there were restaurants with a similar menu. We picked 2 different parts of Seattle. One was closer to downtown, one was in the eastern part. And literally I spent a few hours in a spreadsheet looking up zip codes and seeing which zip code was closer to which merchant. And then I sent that to our marketing person and they segmented the email sends. So this was a very hacky manual way. I would not want to do this for a living, but this allowed us to test what should be obvious, that if the restaurant is closer to you, you're more likely to buy it. And we found that to be very true. And this gave us confidence that there was something here, that we should build this out and invest a lot more expensive technology. And then over time, this became a lot more sophisticated. So if you think about this, here's the pyramid before. Started to focus on relevance to improve conversion. In order to do this, our first thing that we were looking at is location. Which deal was closest to each subscriber? To do that, we had to gather location for people. We asked for a zip code or we used IP address. And then once we had that, we played around with what can we do to make sure the location is relevant and stuff. And this initially was very simple. It was just look on a map, which is closer to you. But then we found other things, like in New York, people in the 5 boroughs would go to Manhattan, but people in Manhattan would never go to the 5 boroughs. And so, we made this more sophisticated over time, but initially it was a very simple MVP version. This success unlocked selection. And so another team started to take up how else can we improve the number of deals that we had. So we started to offer deals not just in the city center where more people were, but get out to the suburbs. Our first Chicago suburban deal was in Evanston. So we had an Evanston restaurant and a downtown restaurant and saw the same results as we saw in Seattle. So we were onto something. We started to add new channels. We briefly had a home and garden channel. That didn't last very long. There weren't enough supply of deals, but it was a good experiment. What did work really well is travel and then events like tickets to concerts and things like that. And so these became really big growth channels for Groupon. But you can see how this is incrementally built out, and it's built out based on a hierarchy here of what do customers actually want to buy. Relevance became a lot more sophisticated over time. We started with location relevance, but then moved into categories. So we found that certain people had a preference to buy certain types of deals a lot. Some categories you didn't want to buy more than one. So hopefully if you do a LASIK treatment, you never need LASIK again. And so we could collect category preference through direct and indirect signals and then figure out how to optimize that. We also realized that some deals are just better than others. There are restaurants that people will travel way across town for, and there are restaurants that people will only go to if they're right next door. So we figured out ways to get predictions about that. And then what ultimately worked better was just launch it to a segment of customers, get a signal, and then use that to optimize. This helped Groupon scale quite a bit to have more than 1,000 daily deals, 142 million subscribers, 45 countries, and this was at the time of the IPO. So I'm not saying this was everything that made Groupon successful, but certainly this helped on the product side. These were some of our bigger innovations to make sure it was more valuable. Again, we used some pretty narrowly defined drivers. We targeted things one at a time, or at least one at a time per engineering team. We could quantify everything, which helped us know where we're moving the needle. And this thing, visible from space impact, we weren't just moving buttons around or changing colors or things like that. We were looking at things that truly enhance the value of the product with the idea that if the product becomes more valuable, then customers will use it more. And then this helped us go deeper and drive specialization. So how do you use this? I mean, the first step, obviously, is you want to try to figure out what is the pyramid for your customer, for your product, et cetera. When you have this, though, you can use this to determine the focus for your team. If you have a pyramid and you think about which parts of this, which branches are most important, you can be very intentional about your product, what you say yes to and what you say no to. Part of this is to try to limit one or two things at a time per team. So if a team has 10 priorities, this is actually a thing that came up a lot. We did OKR reviews at DoorDash, and my engineering partner inevitably every single time would say there are more priorities than people. And obviously if you do that, most of those priorities are not going to make much progress at all. So be realistic about it. Pick the one or two that really matter and focus on them and go deep. If your team expands, whether you're part of a bigger organization or whether you're successful enough that your organization grows, this is where it helps with that. You can apply Conway's law here, which is you ship your org chart. You can think about it as ideally a team can focus on each of those nodes. And that might not be in the bottom of the pyramid where they're very specific. It might be in the middle or closer to the top, but it helps clarify what the team's charters are, what they're working on, and how they can measure their own progress. And so if you're the product manager for one of those teams, you can look at your pyramid and say, our team owns this. How can we do this? Here are the levers that we have. And here's the dashboard we create for this. This should help you move faster. I mentioned talking about how this informs your priorities and your initiatives. Most of what you work on should be related to your pyramid. And ideally, again, to one or two parts of the pyramid very specifically. That might change over time. You might say this quarter, this is our focus. Next quarter, we're going to have a different focus, but think about keeping them in the same area where you're working towards the same objective. If you get new ideas thrown at you, which occasionally happens in product, from the CEO or from sales, et cetera, this can help you be more thoughtful about whether you say yes or no or not now. If it's in your core area, it's more likely to be a fit with what you want to work on currently. If it's not on, if it's a different branch of your pyramid, you might say, we'll come back to that we're going to do that later. So you might have a lot of branches of the pyramid that are dormant, so to speak, for a while. So you can say, yeah, good idea. It's in our backlog. Sometimes you'll look at this and say, actually, this is really core. This should be on our pyramid, but it's not. This can be a sanity check for you to say, do we need to revise our pyramid? That will happen. Like there's not a perfect version of a pyramid for a product that is eternal. You should be thinking about this just like your vision. Revisit it and see, is it still working for you? But that shouldn't happen every time a new idea comes up. And then once you have that, this can help you bias towards small iterative releases. If you think about, this is where you can do something that is just a release to improve one specific metric at the bottom of the pyramid. If you're building something that spans the whole thing, it probably can be split up into a bunch of different sub-releases. And they might follow in quick succession, but you don't have to boil the ocean and do everything at once. Usually it's better to isolate one variable, launch it, see if you actually did succeed in moving that metric, and then you can go to the next one if you've made enough progress. And then the big thing here is having these things helps if you use them. So you can use this to set goals. Like before you launch the feature, think about this feature is designed to solve this problem for this customer. If we're successful, we expect this metric to go up by how much or improve by how much. This can feed into your OKRs. So if you think about it as objectives are really, they're going to be higher up on the pyramid. They might be the value drivers in level 2 that I talked about. The key results might be product specific KPIs that are below about adoption, usage, things like that. But one of the valuable things about any metric is you can use this as a feedback loop. If you are honest and if you are evaluating your features, most of them will not show lift. That's just the reality. That's like an industry norm. A lot of people don't realize that because they're not measuring the stuff. They assume 100% of their stuff works because they're smart people. If that's true, you're probably being too conservative about stuff. Maybe you're not, taking risk and you're missing out on things that could be actually big innovations that improve your product by a lot instead of the tiny things that are just like fixing commas or, that kind of stuff. So if you use these metrics consistently, it's a feedback loop. The things that work, you can say, what else looks like this that we can invest in? And say, is there more? Like, did we just scratch the surface of this opportunity? Should we keep iterating and trying to improve this thing? Hopefully your MVP wasn't the complete idea. It's a part of it. So you can look like this tells you to keep going. If it didn't work, that should cause you to pause and think about this a little bit. Like, okay, what have we learned from this? Does this mean this feature itself should get rolled back? Do we have a way to iterate and fix this feature so that it will be successful? Are there other features based on the same assumption that maybe we should prioritize lower because now we have information that this assumption might not be a good assumption, et cetera. And then if you look at like a lot of the stuff about the product operating model and where product management has been going in the last few years, much of this is more successful if it's not just a product manager in a silo looking at the stuff. Bring your engineers and your designers. Hopefully you have an analyst who's helping with this. Get your whole team in here to look at this and learn from this and discuss it and use this so that everyone gets smarter about what's going well, what's not going well, and how do you take action based on these insights. And then stuff that's working, highlight it, celebrate it. Or even learning, celebrate that stuff too. This is the kind of thing where you can pat your team on the back and say, hey, we launched this thing based on this hypothesis. And here's the metric that we're using to measure this. And this metric has gone up. And now here's what we're doing next. As I mentioned, this is art and science. there's some sanity checks that might help you think about making this better. If you know the consulting acronym MICE, mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. Ideally, this pyramid describes the major parts of your product and what you're trying to achieve. And you have minimal overlap between the branches. So you can isolate the variables that you're working on and focus on improving them one at a time. Obviously, you want to be able to observe this. I would much prefer something that can get measured through product customer usage than have a survey that goes out once a quarter. Sometimes you need the survey, and that's good to triangulate and get other information. But if you can build a dashboard, it's much better. Same thing, having it quantifiable so you can have a metric for each node. Think about like ideally we are measuring X, and here's the definition of that metric. And that again should be something that you could put on a dashboard and look at and see, did it go up or down based on what you launched? Obviously, you're doing this to make product decisions, your roadmap, iterations, design. So you want it to be actionable. And then I look at ratios as something is very valuable. So if you can think about like a numerator and denominator, it could be number of users that complete this compared to the number that started. It could be number of times a user comes back, et cetera. But you're trying to isolate to things that are actually driven by the product and limit to external noise. So one of the sanity checks I have on here is if your marketing team doubled their spend tomorrow, would your metrics be completely thrown out, or would it largely still hold and you'd be able to tell like which parts of the product were steady and that kind of thing? So a lot of your metrics should be fairly steady over time, which is not to mean they don't change, but they should be a little bit dampened from the impact of external things. And then please try to avoid vanity metrics. So for most businesses, things like page views do not indicate value. There are exceptions. Like if you look at more things on Facebook or on a news site, to some degree, there may be value there. Although on a news site, if they cut the article up into 10 pages instead of one, that's making it worse, not better. So think about, is this really correlated with what the customer cares about? I use time spent as an example. In some cases, again, with the media site, time spent might be an indication that the customer is getting more value. If you have a game, you probably want the customer to play the game longer. If you are a utility, you probably want the customer to get their job done as quickly as possible. They don't want to spend all day trying to figure out how to pay their credit card bill. So think about this. If I improve this, does my product become more valuable, and can I measure it? This is kind of getting into further applications. Back to the example I gave before where they had the 16 metrics. Sometimes the way to simplify that is to consolidate these into types of metrics that you have. For example, the thing at the top should be, what is the main project outcome that you're trying to target? This is your hypothesis. Almost always this should be on your pyramid. This is the thing, if you do an A/B test, this is the metric that you are going to measure with the control in the experiment group. Sub-metrics are things that help contribute to that, meaning you need someone to start and finish using something. And so there could be stages of a funnel that are sub-metrics. Completing that funnel in and of itself is not value to the customer. It's actually work. But if they don't complete it, they're not going to get the thing that's at the end of that process. Sometimes you need to look at guardrail metrics. Guardrail metrics are things that by doing this, you hope you don't make something else worse. By the way, a pyramid can help on this because sometimes you have two things that are next to each other on the pyramid. One goes up and the other goes down. To know the net impact, you look at the node above that. And so you can see like we saw this at Groupon, we were trying to cross-sell items in a shopping cart. That slightly hurt the checkout completion rate, but by having a multi-item cart, we actually sold more, and we're looking at, is that a net positive or a net negative? And then quality standards are things like bugs and latency, et cetera, crashes. These are probably things that should apply to your whole product regardless of the feature. If it's not fast enough, if it's too buggy, if it crashes all the time, you are getting in the way of value. This is not value by itself, though. Again, this is necessary but not sufficient. So these are different ways to think about things that you might be looking at and might be interested in using. But at the end of the day, the project outcome number one is the thing, like that should be the number one thing that you're looking at. If you make that better, and if you make it sufficiently better, people will even tolerate a little bit of latency or a little bit of bugginess, which is not to say that's good, but then that's an opportunity to make it even better after that. Okay, so that's my prepared remarks. Any questions that people have from this?
Experience, what's the best way to get voice of customer in regards to actual physical product versus like a software, like an app or something?
I'm sorry, can you say it again?
What, in your experience, what's the best way to get voice of customer around physical products? Like you may not have a tracking like of a software that you're releasing.
Oh, you mean track usage and understand these things? Yeah, okay. So the question was, how do you do this for a physical product? That is an example. I know there are some like, Internet of things, sometimes physical products are becoming more connected to where you could send a signal of usage. Assuming that's not possible, then you probably have to be asking customers, whether it's through a survey, which is getting a larger sample, but tends to be more general. You have to get people to complete a survey. It has to be fairly broad and easy to complete, or through interviews, which it's a more expensive process, more time involved, but get out there, talk to them. And that is the kind of thing, by the way, whether it's physical or digital product, is a common thing for this. Talk to your customers, ask them what are they looking for, and that will inform the things that go on this pyramid. Maybe you have an intuitive idea, maybe you have it from past research, but if it's disconnected with why they're buying your product or considering buying your product, then it's not going to be as successful. So yeah, in the case of a purely physical product, you might have to rely on more offline forms of getting input. That's another reason, by the way, to keep it simple, because it's hard to measure a 0.5% improvement in something and isolate from noise. If you're a big company, like when I was at DoorDash, we could measure some changes in terms of basis point improvements. But most companies, and I venture most Chicago headquartered companies, do not have the scale for that. It's pretty rare. So that's where, again, measure the big things. Try to have this be things that are truly important. And think about changes that are big enough that you actually will be able to see if they add up over time.
When you define your metrics and when you don't have relevant data available, how do you come up with your baseline? I want to increase the.
Yeah.
Determine that.
Okay. The question is, how do you get a baseline if you don't have the metric already? And there's a couple of answers to that. One is, if you define this, potentially you can start to build out your dashboards to be a little bit more comprehensive. Now, if you know something is not going to get any near-term focus, then it may not be worth the effort of building the dashboard for that dormant part of the pyramid. But for stuff that is a core part of your product success, this is a signal that you should be understanding, are these things improving or getting worse? On a more tactical level, if you're launching a feature and you define the feature success metrics and you realize we don't currently measure that, the first thing I would do, a small, 1-point story or whatever it takes to build that out, I would create that tracking and at least have tracking for a baseline for whatever duration of feature development you have. So i.e. front load that part of the work, do that before you do anything else, and then you can have a little bit of a sample before the rest of your product goes out. Obviously, if you can A/B test, that also helps because then you have control and an experiment at the same time. But either way, I would try to get the baseline as soon as you can get it. And that might mean a mini project that is just focused on metrics.
So you bring this knowledge to companies and they, I'm guessing, implement it.
Mhm.
sometimes it doesn't work, I'm guessing. Do you ever go back and meet with those companies and like, what is the main reason that it doesn't work when it doesn't work?
Yeah, there's a couple reasons. One is just the pyramid wasn't very well designed, which I hope doesn't happen too often because, you know, in the scenario you identified, we're working with them to help create one. So I would say the main reason though is companies go through this exercise, they say that was interesting, and then they put it aside. Meaning people launch stuff and don't measure afterwards, or they don't create the dashboards to see, is this trending up or is this trending down over time? And so, you know, this is a tool, but it's only as good as its usage.
Showed us examples of two different, one in the beginning with a client and then one with Groupon. They both looked like they had a lot of measures. So, you know, if you step back and look at both of those cases, you know, what would you say were the biggest differences between them?
Okay, that's a good question. The difference between that first one where I said, here's the client that had this list of 16 features, and here's Groupon. So for that client, that list of metrics was for one feature.
Okay, wow. Okay.
And that was a very slow moving project, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
Because they were trying to simultaneously improve and optimize a lot of variables. So the idea of this is, let's say you're running something to improve the signal from people about what types of deals they want. Do they want Italian restaurant deals, or do they want art museum deals, or things like that? This would be one metric for this. And so really we had one success metric here. There are the other performance metrics, meaning look at this and say, we don't want to screw up our latency. We don't want the app to crash because we introduced this. That's mostly QA and monitoring and things like that. And if your team commits to quality, usually those are things you need to monitor, but they're not separate projects or big issues. Yeah, and so this is where you can take that into one metric. And actually, this came out of me helping that client trying to put those metrics in different buckets. So we had part of the simplification was a bunch of things they had on there were either quality standards or guardrail. They weren't necessarily trying to improve latency. They just didn't want to make it worse. And then a lot of the other focus with that client was, okay, of the rest of the stuff, which is really this metric here? Which is the one thing that you're trying to improve? And there are some that could be drivers, but it's, you know, sometimes it's creating a hierarchy of these also clarifies. They know these things only matter if that other thing gets better. Yeah, so there's a couple ways that we took that and made it much simpler and more actionable. And we created their own pyramid as well.
Is there any particular tool that's your favorite or that you use to track your KPIs and OKRs?
Okay.
The dashboard.
Yeah, the question is, do I have a favorite dashboard tool?
Yeah.
I will say the one that you're using is my favorite. No, I'm serious because like this is a common problem at companies that I've been at and that I've helped with is people don't like their tool. And so every couple of years, someone comes in and says, we're implementing something else.
Yeah.
And the problem isn't the tool, it's the metrics that they're putting in the tool.
Yeah.
And so hopefully going through this exercise helps clarify the metrics to put in the tool so that you know what to look at. And also make it actionable. This is another failure mode of these dashboards is either they create the dashboard and don't look at it, or they look at it, but it's not an actionable thing. So they're just like, oh, that was interesting. I looked at it because I'm told I'm supposed to look at my metrics, but they're not actually making decisions. And so whatever format you come up with, even if it's something completely different from this, think about what metrics do you need to make decisions about your product?
Last question.
Okay.
So you talked about the pyramid in the context of work that you're doing right now to measure, how would you think about in terms of product strategy for where you want to go? There's things you're working on that are for the long term. How would you lay that into the group?
Yeah, there's this version here. It's a B2B one. I came from Groupon, so I use, I tend to talk about that, but you could think about one that a lot of these are future ones. So you build out the pyramid. Actually, I could use the Groupon example here. You know, at the beginning, all they were working on is selection, and it was baby steps in selection. Then we grew a little bit. We formed a team that was working on relevance, and that was baby steps, and then eventually bigger step changes in relevance. And, you know, but still relevance was always important to customers. Before it was just, I would get the email with the deal and I would delete it. And I would delete it at a high rate because usually it was something I didn't want. And so, you know, this is, you could think about it that way. Like initially we couldn't do everything because it was a small team. Over time, we could do more. And also over time, we could switch from one priority to another based on what was the immediate need. And so you could still build out your pyramid. And like I was working with a client this morning, he had a bunch of these in purple and a bunch of these in gray. And gray is like, I'm not working on this right now. But it's part of the vision. It's where we want to go to. They just raised money, so they're going to build up team a little bit. Or it could be that we're going to get to it in 2025, second half of the year, that kind of stuff. So, you know, there's the theory of what you want the product to become that also overlaps through the vision. And then there's the decision about what you're actively investing in at any given time. I think we're out of time, but I can stick around and answer questions one-on-one too.
Yeah.
All right, so we've got 10 minutes until the next talk. Let me see if I can get here. Yes, so here we have a quick innovation workshop. Downstairs, we have Michelle brothers doing mastering remote and AI driven research. And then Nishant's also downstairs and Doherty doing product centricity and B2B products. So once again, thank you very much. That was wonderful.
You sure did. Irritating, right?
Thank you for the napkins.
But it's done now. It's in the room.
Come back till Monday.
There you go.
Hey, I got a circle.
I know everyone's going to go to the other. Yeah, they should.
One's here.
Going to. I have certainty.
Yeah.
Down.
Maybe some stress. Yeah. This person has been falling. No, it was good. Good chat with you. I feel.